immediately opening the diagonals for the queen and king's bishop. This thrust asserts central influence and prepares for rapid development. Directly mirrors white's central advance, immediately contesting the vital king's pawn square and opening lines for piece development. Developing a knight immediately strikes at black's pawn, dictating the game's early direction and preparing to castle. Developing the knight to its natural square, nc6, immediately contests the central e-pawn and prepares for a dynamic battle. This develops a piece, putting immediate pressure on black's knight and influencing the center. Challenging the bishop's placement, black aims to gain a tempo, potentially freeing the c6 knight's development. Doubling the pawns fundamentally alters black's pawn structure, creating immediate structural weaknesses that white aims to exploit. Doubling pawns weakens the queenside pawn structure, potentially creating targets. Safeguarding the monarch immediately solidifies your position, preparing for a harmonious development of remaining pieces. Suddenly weakening the king's diagonal invites tactical trouble. Consider bolstering defense rather than pushing pawns. Opening the center now exploits black's slightly compromised pawn structure, creating dynamic attacking chances. The doubled pawns on c6 create a persistent positional scar that black must work to overcome. Reclaiming the center with this knight redeems white's central pawn structure, opening attacking lines. Challenging white's central pawn and opening a diagonal for the queen is a bold, but potentially precarious counterthrust. Repositioning the knight to e2 aims to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for kingside castling, albeit at the cost of immediate central activity. Trading queens here, black initiates an endgame with doubled pawns, simplifying the position but creating lasting structural weaknesses. Reclaiming the file offers white a clear advantage, preparing to exploit black's doubled pawns and underdeveloped kingside. Developing the bishop here prepares to castle, aiming for a more secure king position and better coordination of your remaining pieces. Developing the knight from its current location prepares to contest the open files and brings another piece into the game, aiming for greater coordination. Securing the king in a safe harbor amid this unfolding pawn structure is a prudent defensive maneuver. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers valuable counterplay. Repositioning the rook to the second rank aims to defend against potential central pawn pushes and prepare for queenside activity. Reclaiming the bishop's diagonal, black repositions to challenge white's central control and prepare for pawn advancement. Centralizing the rook bolsters pressure along the d-file, preparing for potential exchanges and improving piece coordination. The bishop now eyes the long diagonal, potentially disrupting white's central control and preparing for future pawn advances. Unlocking the c-file and challenging black's rook is key to white's developing initiative. Exchanging the bishop clarifies black's pawn structure, easing the pressure on the d-file and opening lines for active piece play. Reclaiming a central outpost solidifies white's knight's presence, opening avenues for initiative. The knight's maneuver to h6 neglects central control and looks for obscure maneuvers, potentially weakening the kingside's pawn shield. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure proactively prevents any immediate pawn breaks and reinforces white's king's safety. Challenging the center, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's knight coordination and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Sacrificing the pawn opens lines for white's rook and bishop, aiming to exploit black's weakened kingside. Reclaiming the pawn reestablishes piece balance, but the knight's placement on the rim leaves it vulnerable to further positional squeeze. Stepping the monarch sideways bolsters its safety amid the doubled pawns, a prudent defensive measure. The knight now occupies a potent outpost, harassing the white king's defenses. Securing the rook on the open file solidifies white's central control, while preparing for potential queenside activity. Reinforcing the central open file with the rook is a sound positional decision, aiming for improved coordination. Exploiting black's doubled pawns, This knight redeploys to a more active central square, threatening disruptions and potentially opening lines. Recapturing the knight opens lines for your rook and unblocks your queen's diagonal, seeking dynamic counterplay. Stepping back, the rook frees it to support the kingside advance, eyeing central squares. The exchange clears the way for your rook to dominate the open file, creating immediate pressure on white's king. King now finds a safer square, centralizing power for the coming middle game. The king's retreat opens a vital file for the rook's aggressive potential. Recapturing the pawn opens critical diagonal lines, albeit with a slightly exposed monarch. Expanding on the queen side, black aims to create counterplay and free their pieces, but risks weakening the pawn structure and inviting white's rooks. Re-establishing the knight on the king side offers attacking prospects and reinforces central control. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges white's central control and opens avenues for black's pieces. Unlocking the c4 knight's influence, this repositions to centralize its power and challenge black's rook activity. The knight's journey to e3 creates a thorny outpost, disrupting white's central structure and eyeing vulnerable squares. Initiating pawn expansion on the king side seeks to disrupt black's king safety and create new attacking avenues. A subtle maneuver aiming to redeploy the bishop, eyeing central control and potential pawn advances. Repositioning the knight to g3 aims to defend the e4 pawn and prepare for potential kingside operations, while keeping an eye on the central tension. Pushing this pawn disrupts white's queenside structure, aiming to create queenside counterplay and open lines for black's rook. Anchoring the rook to the c-file now challenges black's advanced pawns and restricts their mobility. Unblocking the c-file for white's rook, this piece reassumes its post to pressure the center. Harnessing the knight's strength on the edge to threaten deeper penetration. Seizing the open c-file offers a promising pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's queenside coordination and potentially gain a passed pawn. Opening the b-file creates immediate pawn tension and potential lines for attack. Unlocking the c-file opens a furious path for your rooks, challenging white's central pawn structure and potentially isolating the knight. Unleashing a knight sacrifice aims to shatter black's central pawn barrier, potentially opening lines towards the king. Unleashing the rook to the 7th demands vigilance. Its penetration poses a serious threat to white's weakened queenside structure. Pivoting the knight to a more active diagonal may force concessions from black's precarious pawn structure. Reigniting the central struggle, the knight repositions to menace d2 and square off against the king's shelter. Reclaiming the central pawns feels crucial, but the knight's placement on the 6th rank opens a vital diagonal for black's bishop. Repositioning the rook to the open file creates potential pressure against white's weakened pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn push and potentially threaten squares like c5 or d6. Targeting the newly weakened queenside pawn structure with the knight offers a promising path to disrupting white's coordination. Centering the king offers a slight safety net amid the encroaching enemy cavalry. Seeking to undermine white's central pawn structure, this maneuver aims to exploit the open files and potential pawn weaknesses. Seeking to unlock the pinned knight's potential by freeing the g-file for potential rook activity. Unlocking that queenside expansion with pawn advances aims to destabilize white's control. Pushing the knight to f5 aims to exploit black's weakened kingside and potentially launch a swift attack. Shielding the king with the rook allows it to participate more actively in the coming skirmishes, ready to support pawns or attack weak points. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal offers a surprising avenue to pressure black's queenside pawn chain. Unleashing a knight to this fork suddenly creates significant tactical chaos and a material threat. Re-establishing central control with the king is paramount, preparing for eventual queenless complications. The rook infiltrates, seeking control of the now open d-file and eyeing white's exposed king. Unlocking a pawn's potential, this knight retreat sets the stage for a dynamic central pawn push. Unleashing the rook on the second rank offers a fresh assault vector, aiming to exploit the exposed enemy king. A dynamic repositioning of the knight aims to unlock new attacking pathways.